Who would refuse the chance to enter a royal palace? If the king himself reached out his hand and invited you to spend the rest of your days in comfort, who could possibly turn that down? And yet, in the Bible, there was one man who quietly stepped back from that very offer. A man who could have risen higher, but chose not to. A man who could have enjoyed more, but did not seek it. Today, through the story of Barzillai, I want us to reflect on what true loyalty before God really looks like. David was king, but one day he was forced to flee like a fugitive. His own son, Absalom, had risen up in rebellion against him. As David left Jerusalem, his steps were heavy, and the people who followed him were exhausted, hungry, and thirsty. He was still the king, but he was no longer treated like one. He was the Lord's anointed, yet he had to pass through the wilderness like a weary refugee. That is when Barzillai appears. 2 Samuel 17 tells us that he brought beds, grain, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese to feed David and the people with him. If you think about it, this was not an easy decision. At that moment, no one yet knew who would win. If he chose the wrong side, he could lose everything. But Barzillai did not calculate the odds. He stood by the king not when the king was strong, but when the king was at his lowest. People usually gather around a king when he is shining, but true loyalty is revealed when the crown begins to shake. Barzillai was a man who looked beyond David's success and saw David's rightful place. He chose loyalty over advantage. He chose what was right over what was profitable. Time passed, and the rebellion came to an end. David was on his way back to Jerusalem. Now the moment had come when Barzillai could finally be rewarded. David said to him, "Come over with me, and I will provide for you in Jerusalem." What an honorable invitation that was. He could have lived in the palace. He could have eaten at the king's table. He could have been admired and envied by everyone around him. And yet, Barzillai's answer is astonishing. "I am now 80 years old. Why should your servant be a burden to my lord the king?" He knew his age. He knew his limits. And more than that, he knew why he had helped David in the first place. He had not done it to be rewarded. He had not done it to gain a position. He had not done it to impress the king and secure a better future for himself. He had simply done what was right. He had simply stood beside the Lord's anointed when that anointed king was suffering. This part of the story lingers deeply in my heart. Barzillai chose the peace of home over the comfort of the palace. He chose quiet loyalty over public reward. He considered it more precious to remain faithful in his place than to sit in a place of honor. And then he says, "Please let your servant return, that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and mother." There is an entire life contained in those words. A life emptied of vanity. A life no longer ruled by ambition. A life with enough maturity to say, before God, what I have is enough. But the story of Barzillai does not end there. Instead of taking the blessing for himself, he recommends Chimham. He lets the favor that could have been his flow to the next generation. Isn't that one of the most beautiful signs of spiritual maturity in old age? Not clinging, but releasing. Not grasping, but raising someone else up. Not trying to preserve one's own name, but becoming a blessing to those who come after. A mature faith does not insist on claiming its final portion. Instead, it can say, "Lord, show your grace not to me, but to this younger one." And the most moving moment comes at the end. Years later, when David is near death and gives his final instructions to Solomon, he does not forget Barzillai. In 1 Kings 2, David tells Solomon to show kindness to Barzillai's sons and let them eat at the king's table. That is the fruit of loyalty. People may forget, but God does not forget. One quiet act of kindness, one service offered without calculation, even a piece of bread and a cup of water given in the wilderness. God never lets such things be wasted. Perhaps many of us, too, face this temptation as we move into the later years of life. Shouldn't I be comfortable now? Shouldn't I be the one receiving honor now? Isn't it finally my turn to enjoy life? Of course, rest is needed. Of course, comfort has its place. But a person of faith understands something deeper. What makes the final years of life beautiful is not comfort, but faithfulness. To remain on the Lord's side to the very end. To stand on the side of what is right, even when no one notices. To keep serving in love, even when there is no reward. That is the fragrance heaven treasures most. When I look at Barzillai, I cannot help but ask myself, am I someone who loves the glory of the king, or someone who stays with the king, even when he is brought low? Do I move when I see a reward, or when I see what is right? Do I want to fill the rest of my days with comfort, or do I want to finish them with faithfulness? Barzillai never entered the palace, but because of that, he entered even more deeply into the king's heart. He refused the king's table, yet his name remained in the king's memory. He turned down the place of honor. Yet before God, he became one of the most radiant figures in the story. Dear friends, what makes the end of a life beautiful is not how much a person possessed. It is not how high a person climbed. It is whether that person remained faithful to the very end. It is whether that person walked beside the Lord, even in the place where he was brought low. That is what truly matters. Like Barzillai, who chose humble loyalty over the comfort of a royal palace, may we also spend the rest of our days standing near the Lord with a quiet but unwavering faith. And when our own story is remembered one day, may it be said of us, he was faithful to the end.